the two big differences that have been found neurologically between liberals and conservatives are that conservatives tend to have larger and perhaps more active amygdalas, and liberals tend to have larger and perhaps more active uh, anterior cingulate cortexes. Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, higher amygdalar activation doesn't necessarily translate into, um, higher levels of fear. What it might be doing is just making you more sensitive to threat.
Right.
So one of the things that we've done um, is we've looked at what sort of stimuli tend to get the attention of liberals versus conservatives. And there's been, some controversy over this, and some people have said they've replicated, and some people said they haven't found anything. So take this with a pinch of salt. But at least what we found is that when you put threatening stimuli in like you present people with a collage of images, and some of these are threatening and some of them are not. Conservatives tend to go straight to those threatening images, and they just tend to spend more time compared to liberals looking at those images. And that doesn't necessarily, and some people, when some of this showed up in the media, that how it was interpreted is we'd found out that conservatives were more scared than liberals or were more afraid of liberals. And that was not what we found at all. And that's not what we claimed. It
Okay.
was that conservatives were more attentive to things that were potentially threatening.
Right. Big
And,
difference.
and maybe that's one of the things. And I mean, this is absolutely speculative because we're still trying to sort out, you know, what the underlying biological differences are and how they really translate into, complex attitudes and behaviors like those surrounding politics. But, one potential explanation is what these amygdala differences do is they just make some people more sensitive to potential threats in their environment, which is, that's not a bad thing. That's not a
Yeah.
derogatory, sometimes we're accused of taking cracks at conservatives, and that's genuinely not what we're trying to do.
What are the physiological responses that you're measuring in a test like this?
So we're measuring the uh, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system. So how we do that is we essentially measure, it's the activation of your sweat glands is what it boils down to. We run a small electric current through the tips of people's fingers and measure electrical resistance. And what happens is when your sweat glands open and close on your fingers, they act like electrical resistors. And what controls those sweat glands is your sympathetic nervous system. And so, we've got a pretty good clean measure of your sympathetic nervous system there. But we can also measure things like respiration, heart rate. We also do electromyography, which is basically muscle contractions. So we put sensors on people's faces on the major muscles associated with emotion. Because sometimes even if you can't really see somebody frowning or smiling, you can still detect electrical activity in those muscles,
Hmm.
which could be reflective of an underlying emotional reaction to something. And in some cases, not always, but in some cases, that can be predictive of political orientations.
Interesting. So then, on these different physiological recordings, how did conservatives compare to liberals in response to these threatening stimuli, images, noises, all the rest?
Yeah, well, what we found, and this is kind of controversial now because there was a big study. Actually, I was tangentially involved in it. We brought in one of the people who did it to our lab, and I really encouraged them to do the replication, and they failed to replicate it. But what we've found in our lab is that conservatives tend to be more reactive to images that reflect threat and disgust. And the evidence that we found in our lab is a little less strong on liberals, but generally speaking, what we found is that liberals tend to respond marginally more to positively valenced images, puppy dogs and rainbows sorts of things.
Do we have any idea of the order of causality here? Because I know the genetics is very interesting,
Yeah.
but do you think people are born conservatives and hence grow larger amygdalas, or have larger amygdalas and then become conservatives, and then the same for anterior cingulate cortexes and liberals?
Well, this is what I think happens is I think we are, our genetics determine, our genetics they do not predetermine what we're going to be. What our genetics and the environment that we find ourselves in combine to do is they tend to sort of like affect our cognition, what we pay attention to, what we remember. They, genetics and the environment also combine to sort of like shape how we respond to uncertainty, for example. And what all of those things do is I think they predispose us to be more receptive to some sorts of political appeals over other sorts of political appeals. So, our term for it is basically what your biology does. And there's not a clear dividing line between biology and psychology. It's really your psychobiology. What your psychobiology does is it predisposes you. In other words, it pushes the probabilities one way or another. But one of the things that I'm really careful to point out is we are not, I repeat, we are not genetic or biological determinists. People still have agency. You can be completely predisposed to be a conservative and still rationally think your way into be a liberal, and vice versa. But I think a lot of people, one of the things that got us started down this road and doing this sort of study is, if you ask people about their political attitudes and why they believe what they believe politically, they tend to think that their attitudes are common sense and that they're rational. And you don't have to push people that hard to find that in most people, they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, simply in the sense of, they know how they feel, but their attitudes are being driven by those feelings more than they are by reliable, verifiable information and its analysis. And politics, we came around to the point of view that politics, or a lot of political attitudes and behaviors, are essentially driven by emotion. And people can't fully explain why they are doing what they are doing politically. They rationalize it a lot, but we believe that it's primarily being driven by emotion. And so, what sort of like sent us down this whole rabbit hole is, where do those emotions come from? How do they arise? And why are some people responding to, you can take two different people, put them in exactly the same place at exactly the same time and give them exactly the same political stimulus, and they'll respond differently to it emotionally. Why is that? And does that help explain why liberals and conservatives are different? And we believe it does.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then I'm so confident you will enjoy even more the full conversation. You can click it here. Click it. Come on. You know you want to. Click it.